Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for coming for our November session of the series Analysis of Penality Across Boundaries that we organize from the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research in the National University of Litoral in Argentina and the University of A Coruña in Spain. So we will have today as a presenter Ramiro Gual from the University of Buenos Aires. He will present his paper, Resisting Devoto, Challenging Practices from a Federal Male Prison in Argentina. As we usually do, Ramiro will present for something like half an hour, and then we will have a moment for questions and answers. Ramiro, many thanks for accepting our invitation. It's a great pleasure to have you here. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Máximo and Richard, for the invitation and everyone for being here. I will try to share my screen. That is okay. So, well, thank you again. As Máximo said, the paper I would like to discuss with you today is Resisting Devoto, Challenging Practices from a Federal Male Prison in Argentina. It is part of my PhD project. It was an ethnography I conduct for 3 years in Devoto prison, the single one prison in the Buenos Aires city. It's a federal male adult male prison. And what I tried to understand in that PhD project was to describe and analyze the interactions among prisoners and with officers and how these interactions produce in some way a very peculiar type of prison governance. The ethnography I conducted was between 2021 and 2023. I conduct observations, focus groups with incarcerated university students. I analyze different documents, and I conduct also 11 ethnographic interviews with prisoners and 91 semi-structured interviews with prisoners, officers, and other actors around the prison systems, like the teachers or professors in the elementary, high school inside the prison, and also the university in prison program run for 40 years in that specific facility. The access to the fieldwork was in two different ways, in some way complementary ways. For one side, I am a professor in that university in prison program I have mentioned before, and I am also part of the penitentiary procurator's office. It's some kind of a human rights state agency dedicated to control the federal system. As a part of that research, what I would like to discuss with you today is about these practices of resistance. I would like to describe, categorize, and analyze prisoner practices of resistance in Devoto as a counterpower exercise, but also as a way to escape, if not materially, from the prisons. What I would like to discuss is, or I would like to understand better, maybe when the session ends, is what are these practices of resistance, what are their main characteristics, how do they combine with each other, and how available are anytime, every prison, and for any prisoner. I would like to discuss some of the findings with several theoretical approaches, like discussion about negotiation in prison as the problem of order in prison, and the resistance practices inside the prisons too. The paper, in some way, is divided in 3 sections. The first, I would like to discuss with you why I think that Devoto is a very peculiar prison in the federal system in Argentina. The second one is to describe, analyze, and categorize these 4 types of resistance practices. And finally, I would like to propose you some final remarks to discuss each other in the Q&A moment. First of all, why Devoto is a very peculiar prison. For instance, Devoto is an old prison. I mean, Devoto is very near to his 100th birthday. It was created in 1927, and it means that it is between 50 and 75 years older than the other facilities around Buenos Aires city. As much as it's the only one in the city, there are other facilities around the city, and all of those are between 50 and 75 years newer than Devoto prison. The second characteristic, very, very peculiar in Devoto, is that it was not created as a prison. It was created as a police detention center, and as a consequence of that, there is nothing like correctional issues around the prison. Nothing like workshops, nothing like educational rooms in the original architecture, and nothing like individual cells. As a consequence of that, the interactions between prisoners, but also between prisoners and agents, are much more fluid than in any other prison in the federal system. The third point, as I said before, is that it's the only one facility inside Buenos Aires city, and as a consequence of that, the porosity between the inside and the outside in this prison is much more extended than it already is in the rest of the federal penitentiary system. And as a consequence of that porosity too, there is a university in prison program inside this prison, and it's not just a university in prison program. It's the oldest university in prison program in my country. It has been run for the last 40 years. So in some way, because of these specific characteristics, interactions between prisoners and prison officers are much more frequent, visible, and fluid, and especially permeable to the involvement of other civil actors who daily cross its walls, specifically public defenders, human rights state agencies, and the public university. So I would like to discuss how this specific characteristic of this very, very peculiar prison impacts in the ways that prisoners find to resist the prison. And I would like to discuss with you 4 types of these practices of resistance. The first, what we could call everyday prison life adaptations, are in some way a consequence of that collective dorms and not individual cells. With this practice, prisoners alter the daily routine of the prison and challenges homogenizing effects. Those are cultural norms alongside the law, but without being considered by the actors as a violation of the law. In some way, it tried to discuss or dialogue with Adelbeek and his book about practices of resistance in Norway prisons. And specifically, I would like to remark 2 of these practices. The first is how the prisoners produce in these collective dorms some specific of genuine and individual and particular space to organize their life in this not private place. And the second one, how the prisoners manage to cook their food that in a way that is very, very different than in the other federal prison system, in the other federal prisons in my country. And it is that they receive the food raw, and they need to manage to deliver and cook it all together. Caballito, one of the prisoners I interviewed during my fieldwork, lived during part of our fieldwork in a minimum security guard defined as a worker ward. He recalled how he had carefully placed shelves on the wall with screws and everything to better organize his belongings in this collective space. Because of the absence of conflicts, the searching procedures were not carried out monthly. If officers come, they come to seize phones. Once they didn't come for about 3 months. The day they came, they ripped out all the shelves, everything. They had broken half my wall. I immediately got some ready-mixed cement and plastered half the wall again to put back again what they had thrown at me. The second case about this idea of food and how to persist in discussing the homogeneity effects, Flores, a Peruvian prisoner in the Devoto prison, said the possibility of cooking his own food led him to push the limits. Through the smuggling channels available in prison, he brought in the necessary seasoning to prepare real Peruvian food and miss his homeland less. I flour my meals with spices that came from Peru, like sillao, which is like soy sauce, but it is not soy sauce, and ginger, garlic. I use a lot of garlic, black pepper, cumin, which I get from Peru. They don't allow it here, but I have other means. In some way, the main characteristics of this everyday prison life adaptation as a practice of resistance is that they are do in broad daylight, they are peacefully, and they are not perceived by the actor as illegalities as much as they are in a gray zone between what is allowed and what is not allowed inside the prison. And it is maybe the main difference with the second practice of resistance, the illegal practice are perceived by the prisoners and by the officers as illegal. They are a result of this fluid interaction that are available in this peculiar prison, and they also alter the daily routine of the prison, but are perceived as prison rules violations for both actors. I would like to describe two of these practices. The first is what is called like the carpas, the tents. Yes, it is a combination of sticks and sheets and blankets that are temporarily installed in pre-established places in the courtyards and are fastened to the walls by means of straps. It is not clear for the actors the moment when the tent appears in the horizon of the Devoto prison to allow this greater privilege that any other formal conjugal visit, because they have less requirements, they are more frequent, and they are allowed for a more extension of time than the formal conjugal visit in a visiting room. It is not clear when it begins, but there are several actors, officers, prisoners remember it there something like 30 years ago when they begin to go to the prison as prisoners or to work there. And another thing that is very, very remarked in the tents is the high level of institutionalization they have. There is a moment, it is not written in the legislation, but there is a moment in the day of the visiting day that the guards go to the wing and shout conditioning of the yard. When they shout conditioning of the yard, all the prisoners know that they can go to the courtyard and begin to establish all these temporary tents a few hours before the visiting day begins, so that when the visitors arrive, it is all prepared. It is prepared already. So in some way, the idea is that it is not a practice that it is formally included in the normative, but it is absolutely accepted by the agents, by the officers, and in some way it is accepted in some kind of fatality. One of the officers said to us, the tents are acquired rights. The tent will end the day the Devoto ends. No one with half a brain would think of stopping that reality. One of the prison highest authorities sentenced with a certain hint of fatality. In our regulatory framework, it is banned, but it is maintained. To try to eradicate it without dialogue, without consensus, nor does anyone make any claim. The tent has been there for many years, and in all the visits made by the penitentiary procurator's office and the judiciary, nobody says anything. They are parallel legal realities. With some exceptions, the officers' views of the tent is somewhere between acceptance and fatality, a sort of tacit agreement accepted by all and producer of order. The second illegal practice is this idea of the cell phones. When a search procedure is carried out, cell phones are confiscated. It is different than tents. When tents are inside the wing and the searching procedures arrive to the wing and they found the tents, they don't confiscate it because it's not said as this kind of prohibited elements as cell phones are. The seizure of devices does not imply the imposition of a sanction, of individual sanction to any one of these guys, except if the prisoner is seen in possession of the device or discarding it, because the searching team supposedly find them in a shared place that then they don't know whose it is, a high-ranking officer explained. It is kind of game like the Anton Pirulero, a game in Spanish, laughingly proposed a prisoner. You know that every 2 months I am going to search for cell phones your wing. If you distracted, you lost. Then if you want to have it for 2 months, have it, no problem. And if I catch you, and if I catch it on you, I will sanction you. So in some way, we could discuss in what degree cell phones and tents are resistant practices, or in which degree officers perceive as a resistance these practices and are not allowing as a way to build order inside the prison. The unfaithful person is everywhere, said a high-ranking officer when we talked about the way in which telephones are brought in. All the prisoners affirmed that the officers did not participate in the allocation of tent sites, nor did they obtain any economic benefit from this practice. The situation was quite different with regard to the cell phones. No prisoner was willing to accept the official version that cell phones were brought by the relatives during the visit days. I know that the only supplier of all these things is the prison service. Let's respect those women's relatives. Cell phones get in because officers get in themselves. Otherwise, these don't get in. Is there corruption? Of course there are, said one of the prisoners. So in some way, if we need to describe the main characteristics of these illegal practices as a second way or as a second type of practice of resistance, we could say that these illegal practices are peacefully. They have no intention of revalidation by new rules nor court decisions to make these practices formally accepted, and they could be in broad daylight or not. It depends if the tent that is clearly visible and the cell phones that are more in the shadows. The third kind of practice of resistance is what we could call uprisings. It's a result of its urban location and the high degree of porosity this prison have. And I mean that is because this, for all the prisoners, but also for the officers, Devoto is seen as the uprising prison in the federal system because of the urban location and the possibility to make some kind of to get some kind of response of these kind of discussions. These are traditional and open opposition to structural prison problems. Maybe in the last year, the more shocking uprising in the Devoto prison was the COVID protest in April 2020. On April 2020, Argentina's TV news programs, websites, and social media were filming the roofs of the Devoto in the days. On them, a score of prisoners shouted to the judiciary, political authorities, and the community in general their discontent for the lack of implementation of preventive measures against COVID and the delay in the resolution of requests for early release for elderly prisoners or those with risk pathologies. Prisoners displayed banners announcing that COVID was in the Devoto, that they refused to die in prison, and the silence was not their language in response to a traditional song in my country. The uprising began shortly after the morning count. It is part of my field work notes. Prisoners managed to take control of the interior of the blocks and wander freely between the wards, the central staircase, and the offices within the blocks. In some cases, they managed to get out through the windows and walk across the roof of the central corridor connecting the blocks. The walls, areas outside the blocks, control posts, workshops, and offices outside the security perimeter remained under the control of the prison administration. After some hours of uncertainty, representatives from different ward prisoners, prison service, Minister of Justice, and judicial authorities met in the prison chapel. In the presence of third parties, they agreed to create a dialogue table to work on the prisoners' claims who descend from the roofs and return peacefully to their wards. In some way, these uprisings and its main characteristics of this third kind of practice of resistance is that they are visible challenges to the authorities. They appeal to higher prison structures, external actors, and the society in general, and in some way, they could suppose different degrees of disturbance, even damages and violence in some extreme cases. The fourth type I would like to discuss with you is the type what I would call censoriousness, renaming the concept that was built by Mathisen in his seminal book in 1965, and what he said is this idea of the criticism of those in power for not following in their conduct the principles that are established as correct in the social system. As a tactic, it assumes the existence of a certain level of consensus on the values and norms that permeate those who govern and those who are governed. It's in some way a clear consequence of the university in prison experience and the language and the tools of the law that the students get during their activities in the university center. And they had one of the very first examples that we could think about the censoriousness practices as a practice of resistance in Devoto is the collective and solidarity expression of resistance, like habeas corpus, draft bills, two of the main draft bills in the country to improve the prison conditions for prisoners in the federal system in general, and in Devoto in particular, were a reform to the house arrest legislation and a reform to allow early release for educational achievement for different prisoners. Inside this university in prison program are two practices that we need to think about as examples of censoriousness. The first we have studied in deep with Máximo in the last years is the first and unique prisoners union in my country. It's called SUTPLA. It was born in 2012 inside this university in prison program, and its golden age was until 2015. The success for getting more job assignments, raised payments, and improved safety and hygienic conditions. Daily visits, they managed to have daily visits to wards and more sporadic inspection of the workshops. It was a wonderful moment, one of the prisoners who was part of this union said. Imagine that we went through one block per day, from top to bottom. At the beginning, we even went inside the wards. It breaks the logic of the prison. The prisoners work and supervise. The prisoners work and supervise, not the guards, said Paternal, one of our interviews. The second activity of censoriousness I would like to discuss with you is this idea of free legal advice and asesoría jurídica, free legal advice was born inside the university in prison program in the same moment that the university in prison program was created. One of the most emblematic areas of the Devoto University Center. It is made up of a group of incarcerated students and graduates to provide legal advice to all prisoners in Devoto prison who demand for it, regardless of whether they are university students or not. In some way, this fourth and last type of resistance I want to discuss with you is characterized by the strong and in-depth challenge to the prison, the use of law narratives and tools in advantage of university in prison programs experience. It is a peacefully kind of resistance practice, and it recalled to some kind of external appeal, looking for the revalidation of new rules and the court sentences of these practices they are building. So in some way, if we would like to discuss and to compare these different practices of resistance, we could see that there are four types or four characteristics that are very different between the four types of resisting practices. I think that they are different according to the degree of visibility, violence, perceived, how much they are perceived as illegal for the same actors, and finally, for the intention to formalize the rights they are discussing around this practice. Just 2 or 3 final slides to discuss some final remarks I would like to discuss with you in the Q&A. The first is I use clearly an expansive concept of resistant practices. And it is in some way because it is an internal perspective. In some way, prisoners find out that these 4 types of practices are resistant. They call them as resistance. But in some way, we could think if we should take in account a more external analysis about what is really a resistance or what is not. Maybe the concept of negative reforms produced by Mattison could be a good way to discuss what is resistant and what is not of these several practices I will try to describe today. The second one is that they are not isolated practices. In some way, they appear in different moments in a combination situation where one practice appears and the other continuing with a same logic of strategy combining different practices at the same time. The third thing is that not always they are a rational choice. I mean, in some ways, you can find some of these practices trying to arrive to objective, but in the way you find that they are not the more rational way to arrive it. I mean, it's not the best way to think about these resistant practices in a rational choice. For example, the uprising of Devoto at the COVID was clearly identified for several actors inside the prison as an irrational way to discuss the problem they have in front of them. The fourth thing I would like to discuss is how this is that in some way the resistance practices or the resistant attitude is a potential reaction anytime in every prison and for all the prisoners because of the pain of imprisonment that Devoto means and the federal system in Argentina means in general. But anyway, from resistance, there are different prisoners respond to these pains of imprisonment resisting or maybe with fatalistic resignation and with a high degree of options in the middle of these 2 specific points. Resistance, fatalistic resignation, and a lot of degrees in the middle of these positions. So in some way, one of the very interesting things I think to discuss is what are the reasons to choose resisting or to resist, to decide to resignation. It has to be with individual capital and the prisoner journey, as Wheeler would help us to think about it. It has to be with the solidarity bonds and leadership that are built inside the Devoto prisoner community. It has to be with the officer attitudes in different moments, in different times, with different prisoners in different space inside the Devoto prisons. Or it has to be with the external support they receive that is also moving from more extended support to less extended support. I would like to discuss this point with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ramiro, for this very interesting presentation. Many thanks.